It's a pleasure to welcome you to a very special meeting with Ibrahim Dalalsha and Ehud Yaari that will consider the impact of the recently US brokered normalization deal between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, and who knows who else, on the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis. And we'll also consider the difference between Biden and Trump for both Israelis and Palestinians. Let me begin by thanking our UCLA co-sponsors, the Luskin School of Public Affairs, Berkel Center for International Relations, and the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. And we are so delighted that so many of you have chosen to join us from all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to our first speaker, Ibrahim Dalalsha, who is a senior political consultant based in the West Bank. Currently, he heads a private think tank in Ramallah, the Horizon Center for Political Studies, and media outreach. Mr. Dalalsha's former role as senior political advisor at the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem spanned 2 decades. He has been named the State Department's Foreign Service National of the Year for outstanding political analysis, reporting, and extraordinary networking outreach 3 times throughout his career. Dalalsha has played an integral role in peace negotiations across the Middle East, including the 2014 ceasefire negotiations that were held in Cairo, in addition to other initiatives in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Ibrahim?
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. I would like to start by actually also thanking the Summit staff for organizing this and for the opportunity to discuss the what I call the current political impasse, while the topic actually is about new policies, new relations. And basically, I will do the best I can to be concise, use only the 10 minutes that I have, and address the issues in 3 basic points. And those are, first of all, as I said, the current situation is, is easily characterized, at least from a Palestinian perspective, by being an impasse. And under that point, I will explain why. The second one will be actually the Abraham Accords, and whether those accords are a bypass to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or an opportunity to promote a solution to it. And the third one is the, the point that everyone asks about almost every opportunity I have to discuss these issues with foreigners and even in some cases with Palestinians. And that is, what is the Palestinian strategy to deal with this, with the current situation? First of all, we go to the current impasse, and I think it's important to remind us all that the current impasse and cut in relations and basically no progress whatsoever on any peace track with the Israelis and with the United States administration started in 2017, started basically with unilateral American steps that were taken against the Palestinian interests, against the previous US administration policies, and basically against all the terms of reference and past agreements. And this started with abrupt sanctions, including closing the PLO office in Washington in 2017, followed by the Jerusalem Proclamation, which recognized Jerusalem as Israel's unified Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and subsequently was declared by President Trump as Jerusalem off the table. And the defunding UNRWA and defunding basically all assistance programs, including to the Palestinian security forces at that time, were all hits that came from the US administration without any Palestinian sort of policy or step that caused it. It was basically apparently in preparation for what came later, which is the announcement of the so-called US peace plan. which is known as the officially as the U.S. Vision for Peace and Prosperity. And that was apparently meant to put pressure on the Palestinians to accept those terms. I'm not going to expand on any of these points or items, but basically it's very important to remember that the Palestinian, and when I say the Palestinian or the Palestinians, I don't only refer to the Palestinian leadership. I also refer to the Palestinian public. I refer to the Palestinian political factions and forces, civil society, and all groups rejected unanimously, and will continue to reject the terms under the U.S. peace plan. And those basically, the Palestinian rejection of this plan is not based on trying to improve or trying to actually amend or trying to fix the terms of that deal. Simply, when the deal was released or published, it was clear that this deal did not meet the minimal aspirations of the Palestinian people. That it took out all terms of references. It replaced it with a religious political narrative embraced mainly by Israeli right wing, and it took out all references to what was described or called in parallel statements by U.S. officials and others that took out all the irrelevant, pertinent UN resolutions that have been enshrined by the United Nations or enacted by the United Nations, different bodies throughout the decades, and were actually part of the terms of reference on signed agreements between the Palestinians and Israelis, and were also embraced previously by all Republican and Democratic administrations who sponsored the peace process throughout and the peace track between the Palestinians and Israelis over the years. Moving also to the fact that the plan does not create an independent state for the Palestinians. It does not create a homeland for the Palestinians. In fact, it simply gives or creates a fake state completely under Israeli land, space, borders, and complete control and sovereignty. And as such, it perpetuates the conflict, or at best, it sort of transforms it into a different shape, but does not address any of the root reasons of this conflict. I don't need to highlight or basically even mention the international reactions. Again, as I mentioned, the previous U.S. administration's reactions, even when it comes to the United Nations, the Quartet, the international body that is formed of 3 plus the U.S. as sponsors of the peace process, all of those collectively, I mean, those positions are very clear, and basically none of those players have pushed the Palestinians or even tried to convince them of accepting this peace plan. So it ended up basically being, in my opinion, a total failure. Failure in the sense that it did not move the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations any further. In fact, one could even conclude that the publication of that plan has caused harm to the Israeli-Palestinian sensitive contacts and management of the conflict, even when there was and has been a political impasse for almost 10 years. The Palestinians and Israelis continued to work together on many different tracks in order to avoid a deterioration or an eruption of violence. Even that was impacted by the publication of the U.S. peace plan, and it was used by the Israeli government to declare, what they wanted to do in the West Bank, which is annexation based on the plan that was released. And again, that I think may explain the Palestinian perspective in terms of, refusing to engage with the current U.S. administration or the Israeli government on the parameters or on the collective of the so-called U.S. peace, officially called the U.S. Vision for Peace and Prosperity. Now, moving to the second point, which is the subsequent Abraham Accords. Now, many parties have actually described the Palestinian reaction to those accords as maybe in some ways a wasted opportunity that Palestinians ought or should have engaged with the Gulf states and other states who are promoting and basically who are either involved or supporting and promoting these agreements. And in fact, in any objective assessment to those accords, one concludes easily that this is basically a shot in the dark type of accusation, simply because when you look at the Abraham Accords, you can easily see that these accords are basically not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These accords are about bilateral Israeli-Arab relations and do not address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in fact, the small part of it being that addresses the Israeli-Palestinian conflict being the claim or perception that this canceled the Israeli annexation plans of the West Bank was immediately dismissed by the Israeli Prime Minister, by senior U.S. officials, who basically said that there is a suspension, temporary freeze, but it does not constitute a cancellation of it. So in other words, we go back to the main point, which is these accords are not about addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and as such, there is no wasted opportunity for Palestinians in this context. In many ways, those agreements did not really create new realities in the Middle East, as some would like to point out, because I think by now it's no secret to say that there have been secret contacts, relations, low profile, if not secretive, relations between Israel and those countries. And basically, those relations coming out to the public and being formalized, regardless, of course, of the motivations, pressures, and incentives provided to promote these relations between Israel and a number of those important influential countries in the region. We remain basically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself is left behind. Now, I would like to point out that when it comes to the Palestinian official reaction and even like public reaction to these agreements, one need to understand that the Arab Peace Initiative was never a Palestinian plan. It was an Arab plan promoted, supported, and embraced by Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, followed by all Arab countries in summit resolutions, in Arab summit resolutions, and even Islamic countries, summit resolutions. And it was the main tool that the Palestinian side had presented to the Israelis over the years to provide a package of incentives, end of occupation with equal total normalization, full normalization of relations with Arab countries, Arab people. So the Palestinian leadership as such, and the Palestinian people behind it who embraced the Arab Peace Initiative, had never opposed or objected to normalization between Israel and the Arab countries. It's about the sequence of it. It's about not being left behind. It's about the package of incentives that would be given to the state of Israel to normalize its status in the region, not only with governments and rulers, but also with people, starting with the Palestinian people. And that would have been the logical way of implementing the Arab Peace Initiative. Of course, reality is more complex than that. New alliances are being formed, and the main, I think, reflection here needs to be focused on. And since we're addressing the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in this specific debate or session, we need to understand that I think the fact that Israel would normalize, relations with Arab countries, including, the Emirates, Bahrain, and maybe other countries are coming in line. It will cause. This will, to be very honest, it is seen. It is a short-term gain for the Israeli Prime Minister, and there is no doubt that this would actually. Come in his favor and in calculation of maybe election considerations, whether in the US or in Israel. But regardless, I think objectively one needs to look at the longer term impact of it and reflections. And I think, again, one of the key points that need to be always on the table is that the more Israel gets in terms of normalization from Arab countries, the less incentive it has to make compromises, with the Palestinians, meeting, the Palestinian demands to create a real sovereign and independent Palestinian state, according to the known terms of reference. I would also like to remind us all that the ticking bomb, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, will continue to be there. It will, even peace agreements have been and treaties have been signed in the past with countries who were at war, and those were actually much more, I think, important and relevant in terms of making peace with Israel, and that is Jordan, Egypt, starting with Egypt, and then following with Jordan. And those did not actually maybe change the shape and form of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict itself, but did not eliminate it, did not actually bring peace to the region in the full sense of the term and true intentions of it. So, I think on the longer term, for those who seek a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, everyone needs to understand that, the short term and bypass of normalization with the state of Israel and Arab countries may well not serve the ultimate goal of creating two states and having peace in the region. The withheld view, by the way, that one hears a lot from mainly from right-wing Israeli politicians, analysts, and others, that the Palestinians will eventually come to the table and that they will give up their positions. And I think this is a major mistake in calculations. The Palestinian position, we'll speak about that in the last part of this presentation, is not about giving up on the basics of the solution that would create a Palestinian homeland state and a national identity. We also need to remember that the Palestinian people, who have nearly doubled between 1997 and 2005, from being 2.7 million to actually 5 million now, and statistical projections talk about an estimate of at least 7 million in the year 2030, which is like 1 decade from now. Those people are not going anywhere. The problem is going to be worsened, and the prospects of solving the conflict will become much more intractable, so long as there is more radicalization, both on the Israeli side, having gains regionally and leaving behind the Palestinian problem being a minor issue does not actually worth, or is not worth for Israel to make compromises, territorial compromises, to be specific. The longer time passes without a resolution to this, it's going to create a big, I think, and a much more or deeper crisis in terms of prospects of solving this. Moving quickly to the crisis in relations between the Arab countries and specifically those countries who signed the normalization deals and the Palestinians. As I said, the Palestinian, the Arab Peace Initiative was not a Palestinian veto on these relations. This was an Arab peace initiative, an Islamic peace initiative. The Palestinian leadership fully supported the plan, including the normalization part. But again, it was the sequence. Flipping, canceling, or bypassing the Arab Peace Initiative is counterproductive to the Palestinian political plan and ambitions in the short and medium terms. That's not a secret. But eventually, again, this will not cause the Palestinians to give up the basics of their own and the foundations of their own state and their national and normal and legal rights in terms of the final status solution. But I would like to actually mention something that I think people ought to understand, is that these agreements are not going to be the end of the Palestinian Arab relations. Yes, there is a crisis in those relations that was reflected in bilateral connections, but I would like contacts, and in the Arab League meeting, the last one, Palestinians were angry, were frustrated, they were not consulted. All of that is true, but I think the Palestinian leadership and Palestinian people both, I think, are in full support of maintaining the Arabic dimension of the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people. We're Arabs at the end of the day, and there is nothing that is going to change that, even if we have differences. And I think, one sign that was given by the Palestinian Authority is that they recalled their ambassadors for consultations from those two specific countries, Bahrain and Emirates, but, there was no, and that does not constitute an end of relations or cut off severe diplomatic relations and political relations, because, those kind of relations between Palestinians and those countries, whether at the official level or at the people's level, go beyond the political differences. And a case in point, if anyone has doubt about this is my own assessment and projection about having to go back and resolve those differences, is the fact that when Egypt signed, which was a much bigger, I think, turnaround in the Middle East, when they signed the Camp David Accords, and regardless who was to blame, whether it's Palestinians or Egyptians, the Palestinians took at least I think 4 years, and President Arafat at that time went back to Egypt and rebuilt the Palestinian-Egyptian alliance, which led all the peace efforts afterwards, especially after the signing the Oslo Accords. And I think there are quiet contacts between the all the respective countries and the Palestinian Authority in order to fix those political differences and find a new approach to dealing with those differences and get back on a serious track to support and help a peaceful end to and resolution to the conflict with Israel. That does not mean, by the way, that the Palestinians will accept and endorse the shift in the Arab peace initiative, but it simply means that we disagree on this. But there are much more. There are other reasons that we ought to get together in order to continue the march. I'm going to finish. I'm not sure how good or bad I'm doing in terms of time, but I'm about to finish. Steve?
Yes, you're over time, so we've let you have considerably more, so you should come to a conclusion.
Okay, all right, quickly.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to actually basically highlight the third point, which has to do with the Palestinian strategy, lack of strategy, plan of action, policies, whatever. I would just like to actually say that despite the political impasse, the Palestinians have indoctrinated, security on top of everything else, and there is a keen Palestinian, I would say actually, eagerness in order to prevent any friction. Palestinians' doctrine is now actually based on, and that's a key change, is based on being a major contributor to bilateral Israeli-Palestinian, regional and international peace. Insistence on actually pursuing non-violent resistance, even if ineffective, but still, not to go to that cycle or go back to cycles of violence. On the political track, the Palestinians are mustering support for their own position, expressing willingness to engage in direct negotiations under the known terms of reference. And under terms of reference, I would like to say that this is not the Palestinians echoing slogans of the past. Starting a peace negotiation with Israel on internationally agreed terms of reference and signed agreements doesn't necessarily mean it will have to be the end of it. It's a process that starts with those terms of reference as the legal basis, but does not actually dictate conditions as the Trump peace plan tried to put on Palestinians. No secret to actually say that the Palestinians are waiting for the result of the US elections, and regardless who wins, the Palestinian only weapon is basically presentation of more pragmatic approach towards a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Lastly, on the domestic level, Palestinians are trying against the political odds and differences and regional, international, and other challenges to put their home in order. And I refer here to the contacts between Hamas and Fatah, who would agree on having a new approach of holding general elections on politically agreed terms that would be generally accepted to both sides and to the international community to actually embrace for the coming phase and the coming challenges. With that, I actually finish. Steve, thank you so much for this. And you can actually give like additional time to Ehud if he complains about me going over time. Thank you.
Well, I think Ehud just heard that. Thank you very much, Ibrahim. And speaking of Ehud, some of you know him from Israeli television. He has been a Middle East commentator for Israel's Channel 2 since 1975. He is also a Laffer International Fellow at the Washington Institute and a former associate editor of Jerusalem Report. Among his numerous awards for journalism are the Israeli Press Editors-in-Chief Prize for coverage of the peace process with Egypt, the Sokolov Prize for coverage of the Lebanon War and the Israel Broadcasting Award for coverage of the Gulf War. Mr. Yaari's articles have appeared in respected newspapers and journals such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and Atlantic Monthly. He is also the author of 8 books on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Before I hand the microphone over to him, I want to tell you that in the half hour before we began testing everything out, we found that for some reason it never happened to either him or us. We could not hear him properly. We tried all sorts of gimmicks. We brought in specialists. We tried to do it with a telephone. And I think we got it to a point where I hope you will be able to hear him, but I do advise that this is not the time to play with one of the kids. And I also advise, or any other noises around you, and I also advise that you turn your computer, if necessary, to its highest level. That's what I have at the moment. So with all of that, Ehud Yaari.
Well, thank you. I hope it works. I'm happy to speak after my good, wise friend Ibrahim, although I don't think we see eye to eye. And I'll make a series of points without going into elaboration. We can do that during a Q&A. Point number 1. The Palestinian leadership has been watching Israel for at least 2 decades, building relationships across the Arab world, mainly in the Gulf. What happened now should come to them as no surprise, but it did. They didn't think it's possible. And now they pretend to be surprised, although they shouldn't be. The second thing is, as I see it, the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah now is in a state of shock and paralysis, which is bad for everybody, including to Israel. I think that most Palestinians, the political class, are aware of the fact that their strategy over the past years since the Oslo Accords of 1993 has misfired, didn't work. So they are asking themselves, what do we do now? And they all realize that they are coming to a major junction in which to have they have to make a decision on how to proceed. Because what they've been doing so far doesn't work. The current decision of the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, and I will say a few words about this leadership in a minute. The current decision is, let's wait for November, January, the elections in America, and see whether we have to deal with a Biden or a Trump. Fine, that makes sense, but it doesn't change the lay of the land. What happened is that the Palestinians understand that they have lost the automatic support of the Arab world, or much of it. They cannot rely anymore on having a veto power over the relations between other Arab states and Israel. The Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, revised from the original Saudi formula, is no longer there. But the Palestinian leadership currently in charge of the PA in Ramallah, PLO, etc., is not only losing the Arab world or parts of it, it's also losing very rapidly the support of the Arab street, of the Palestinian street. People very close to President Abbas are telling me that they feel that at least 70% of the members of the public in the West Bank do not support anymore any of the political factions led by Fatah. All this is taking place amidst an acute economic crisis, an economic crisis which takes the form of the PA refusing to take the money that Israel is willing to transfer to them, customs, VAT, etc. We are now at the sum of 3 billion shekels, a bit less than $1 billion. They are paying 50% salaries, and they can do it for 2 months more, no more. They are transferring $95 million to Gaza every month, to the government employees, etc. For how long? And the private banks, the European countries, the Arab countries are no longer willing to lend money to the PA. What they are telling Mr. Abbas and his numerous representatives is, go talk to the Israelis. You have 3 billion shekels there. Take it. But he's refusing to take it, even if the Israelis are saying, okay, take the 60% of the sum, which is sort of automatic, and we will deduct or will debate the deduction of your subsidies to families of prisoners and terrorists and martyrs, etc., out of the remaining 40% VAT deductions. At this point, the PA is shooting both its legs. There is no other way to describe it. What we see, what I see, I know Ibrahim, my friend, may see it very differently. What I see is that many people around President Abbas, including, I didn't see the list of participants, but including his closest advisors, at least 2 of them, are sort of frequent visitors to CMED conferences, are saying in private, this cannot go on anymore. We need a change of strategy. We need to see what's happening. I will share with you a sentiment that I have for quite a long time now. If somebody wakes me at night and I'm in Jerusalem, 10 minutes from Ramallah, if somebody wakes me at night and says, people are storming, Palestinians are storming the Muqata, the headquarters of Mr. Abbas and his government in Ramallah, I'm not going to fall off my chair. It can happen. And I'm telling you that there are people thinking about it, maybe even planning for it. And I don't know what happens if few hundred people, Palestinians, disenchanted with the performance and the corruption of the PA, try to storm the Muqata. I don't know how the Palestinian security services are going to respond. It's a question. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. I'll just give you one example. A guy I know, a Palestinian, goes under the nickname of Abu Aref, is organizing tens of thousands of Palestinians who work in Israel. And they are being taxed by the Palestinian Authority, etc., etc. They are organizing because they feel they are being robbed by the PA. And when you get tens of thousands of people organizing like this, it becomes an issue. I will go now to the broader context, if I may. The first reaction of the Palestinian Authority, Mr. Abbas and his spokesman. One of them, I hope he recovers, Mr. Arikat, is now treated in an Israeli hospital after he was saying that Israel was spreading the COVID-19 in the territories, having soldiers spitting all around villages in the West Bank. He's being treated in Hadassah Hospital in the Jerusalem. That's the same hospital that I would go to if I need help. But the Palestinian Authority was pressured by Saudi Arabia and others to moderate its tone against the UAE and Bahrain, stop burning UAE flags, Bahraini flags, be more polite in their criticism of that. It worked because the Palestinian Authority, if you compare what they are saying now to what they have said immediately after the signing of the Abrahamic Accords, it's a very different language. So this was done, and I'm telling you, not speculating, that Mr. Abbas is going to send back the ambassadors that he withdrew from Abu Dhabi and Manama. It will take some time. It's happening. In the meantime, waiting for the American elections, what is the tactics of Mr. Abbas and the people around him? And of course, we have different coalitions there already deploying for succession, and I can talk about it. Well, he has allowed Mr. Jibril Rajoub to play a love affair, quote unquote, with Hamas. We will have elections in the West Bank, but we will not compete in the elections. It will be a partnership, joint lists between Hamas and Fatah. We will have a new legislative assembly, and then we will all together re-elect Mr. Abbas as president, etc. It's not going to work. It's not going to be. Nobody is taking it seriously. So the idea that the response to the fact that the Arabs are beginning to abandon the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, that Arab states are rebelling against the wish of the Palestinians to hold a veto power over the relations of Israel is not working anymore. Is the answer some sort of a pseudo-reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah? No way. Because as everybody could hear, those of you who did, I'm sure many did, the recording of the conversation between Salah Haruri, Hamas Istanbul, and Hassan Youssef, Hamas Ramallah, what was he saying? He was saying the truth. We, Hamas, are unable to operate in the West Bank. We need this sort of pseudo deal with Fatah in order to reorganize and re-emerge in the West Bank, even if we have to do it in the framework of a partnership for elections with Fatah. I think Ibrahim will agree with me that there is a very strong resistance within Fatah to this formula. And as to Gaza, I can assure you that most of Hamas will not go for it. But they are wasting time now, waiting for the American elections, talking reconciliation, as if the Palestinian Authority is going to be welcome to retake the Gaza Strip in return for Hamas regaining the ability to operate in the West Bank. That's not going to happen. A word about Hamas that I think I should insert here with your permission. We have elections coming in Hamas in 2 months. For the head of the political bureau, executive committee is the true term. I am taking a bet now, and I'm telling you that Mr. Sanwar Yahya is going to win in Gaza, and Ismail Haniyeh is going to win in the outside, and Mr. Mash'al, Khaled Mash'al, Qatar's candidate, is going to lose. How is this going to affect Qatar's commitment to Gaza? The billions of dollars they're pouring in, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure about the outcome of the elections. And if I speak about Hamas, one more sentence. Hamas militarily is now challenged more than before, because the rockets are basically, not completely, covered by the Iron Dome, the balloons by the new laser weapon that Israel has introduced, and the tunnels are being uncovered one after the other by the new system that Israel has built surrounding the Gaza Strip. The main point of the elections in Hamas is that because of this, what we see is that the military branch of Hamas, Izzeddin al-Qassam, led by the Honorable Marwan Issa, has not yet decided whether they will throw their weight behind Yahya Sanwar, Mushtaha, etc., or they will play it neutral. We'll see. Next point. I think that there is a big misunderstanding amongst the Palestinians, but many, many others, including lots and lots of Israelis. What is the meaning, with all due respect to Bahrain, of the UAE-Israel agreement? This is not a peace deal. I agree, we were not at war. It's described as a deal for normalization. I think it's an understatement, because what it is the first step, maybe more than a first step, towards an alliance and a nucleus for a regional alliance. Anybody who wants to analyze the UAE-Israel deal, MBZ and Bibi, wrong. It goes far beyond that. There are three elements that the Palestinians should, and I'm sure will consider in this context. Number one, the UAE embassy, to the best of my information, is willing, not enthusiastic, but willing to play a role on the Palestinian field. Of course, if Mohammed Dakhlan gets some role, which is a different issue. But I will refer you to the newly founded Abrahamic Fund, US, Israel, UAE, $3 billion. They are willing to put a lot of money into upgrading the border crossings, terminals between the West Bank and Israel, the West Bank and Jordan, railways, industrial parks, etc. It's there. It's big. And if the UAE, if MBZ wants to get Dakhlan back on stage in Palestinian politics, the way, if you want to listen to me, you don't have to, the way is through Gaza, not the West Bank. So, industrial parks in Gaza. The Egyptians don't want industrial parks on their border with Gaza, but there are ways. So there are lots of options opened here by the Abrahamic Accords. And two other major issues. One, UAE joining whatever status as observer. I couldn't care. The EastMed gas organization based in Cairo, in which the PA is a member, and also Jordan and Italy and Greece and Cyprus and Israel and Egypt, because they want to pump oil through Israel to the Mediterranean, which is possible. Maybe not a big financial deal, but possible. And the second thing is for Israel and the UAE to join the Red Sea Council, Red Sea Forum, which was initiated by Saudi Arabia with Egypt, Eritrea, Djibouti, etc., in order to look after the shipping line and lanes in the Red Sea, etc., etc. What I'm trying to say here is the Palestinian leadership should be looking, and I think they're starting to do that, to see this deal between this small Arab state, UAE, and the small Israel as something which represents much more. One word about the prognosis, the look forward. I said before that many of the people around Mr. Abbas, and I'm a guy who have a respect and, if I can say, some affection for him, understand that they need to be starting looking elsewhere. And they do, including those guys that I mentioned before. And if they are at this session, they know who I mean, who are not residing in the West Bank. what we will have to watch now is two coalitions of contenders struggling to ensure their whatever stake in the estate. One is led by the chief of the security of the Palestinian Authority, General Majed Faraj, and the Minister for Civilian Affairs, who is responsible for all ties with Israel, Mr. Hussein Sheikh, and they have others, many others with them. And on the other hand, Mr. Jibril Rajoub, who is the guy playing the Hamas card now, but they let him do that in order to erode his respectability. And his candidate to be the next president of the PA, Mr. Nasser al-Kidwa, a nephew of Arafat, veteran diplomat, who chooses to be in Nice, France now, with his new French wife, and wait for the moment. What I think at this moment is going to happen is that we will see that the different contenders, I don't think Mahmoud al-Alul has a chance, or people can give me other names, but what I think we are going to see is we are going to see an attempt to arrange for dividing the estate of Abu Mazen between different contenders. It's not going to hold for long if it ever comes about. And take it from there. They are all interested in one thing: preventing calling elections in which Marwan Barghouti, sitting in an Israeli prison, will try running from his prison cell as president because he may win. And that's a very complicated situation. So at the end, I'm saying, yes, Steve, I got you now. So at the end I think it's just a matter of time before the Palestinian Authority resumes talks with Israel, accepts the money, the 3 billion shekels that Israel has ready for them, and expect to see what do they hear from Washington. If they have to deal with Trump and his people, again, it's one game. If it's Biden, then they have to see. Is the Biden policy going to be what Mara Radman and Philip like this are suggesting? Let's do another try of the Kerry Indyk experiment, which I think is futile. Or the more sensible people there, Donilon, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, will prevail. And with this, Steve, I will stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ehud. I would say never let the other speaker know. You can take as much time as you want. Any rate, but it's quite fascinating, and we want to get right to work because we only have a half hour for the two of you. And I want to remind everybody that if you're joining us via Zoom, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please provide your full name and the country you represent. Unfortunately, if you're watching us on YouTube, the comments are disabled. I was going to ask some questions. I'm going to get rid of that. I have a very interesting question that came up in my reports, very early, and that is from Samir Shawa from Palestine. And I read it now. Has anything changed over the past 4 years for the Democrats, Biden to make a significant change in Middle East policy? And what change would they make? Ehud just finished on that note. And I would add, I think we know where the Palestinians stand on the two presidential candidates. The Israelis are more complicated, but tend to favor Trump. As the American here, I think that if Biden wins, that they'll test the waters with both sides and try to see if they can do what Ehud was just talking about, trying to get something going. If the Israelis start playing about annexation, they'll have trouble with the administration. If the Palestinians start playing too much with Turkey and Hamas, they'll have trouble. So I think it rests with the two parties we're discussing today. Any comments? Any answer to the question? Ehud, you want to pick up where you left off, or Ibrahim, you want to get involved here?
Yes, Steve. Well, actually, there are so many points that my friend, Ehud mentioned. Some of them are quite serious. And I'm not sure, whether taking the questions now is the priority or basically responding to some of those comments that he had made. But I'll try to do both very quickly. And you stop me when you think is right. First of all, it's not the same game. Palestinians don't get to vote in U.S. elections, but Palestinians do know how to deal with both administrations. And as I mentioned in my earlier presentation, that you have a Palestinian readiness to resume negotiations with Israel, and that's going to be under international umbrella, under the known terms of reference, not under the Trump peace plan that dictates an end game from the start as the terms of reference to start negotiations, which basically means that it's not going to go anywhere. And one of the things that will happen, I think, based on the elections platform of the Democratic Party, and regardless of their ability to impose anything on Israel or not, the Palestinians would want to see the Trump peace plan taken off the table, would want to see the PLO offices reopened in Washington, would want to see, a series of measures that would put back the Palestinian-American relation where it was before. And these are not conditions. These are basically, the unjust steps that were taken by the Trump administration, in addition to the Jerusalem Proclamation and everything else that has happened in the past 4 years. So, if the Trump administration is re-elected, the Palestinians will do more of what they have been doing, including, calling for resumption of negotiations. And my dear friend Ehud, I don't think, that the that there is it's not a secret that the Palestinians are working to resume contacts and basically restore a very fine level of relations with the Arab countries who signed normalization. I don't think that this is a secret, and it should not come as a surprise. It is not going to be, however, at the expense of Palestinians saying, yeah, we agree with the Trump administration's plan, and please represent us to the U.S. administration. These are two different and two, I think, misconceptions. The Palestinians don't want to alienate their Arab countries who are, the strategic dimension of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian leadership alike. And yes, there was an eruption of emotional reaction at the beginning, but it's not, a calculated, angry alienation of those countries. I wish that this would be clear. And the Palestinians cannot survive and live, politically and otherwise, without the support of all those Arab countries. Steve mentioned something about changing alliances. I assure you that that the Palestinian leadership is not changing alliances. The Palestinian leadership is fixing and working to fix those complex set of circumstances created by mainly the U.S. pressure on those countries. And the other point, or many other points that Ehud mentioned, you guys, you focus or over-focus on internal Palestinian political dynamics, maybe rightly so. We do focus on Israeli internal dynamics, and maybe rightly so. As you mentioned, that some people are planning to storm Muqata'a because of President Abbas's policies. I actually saw on Israeli TV that people did go in almost into Prime Minister Netanyahu's office because of charges of corruption and other things. And we do not actually take that and say, okay, look, we're not going to deal with Prime Minister Netanyahu. These are Israeli internal affairs. He can fix it. We deal with the Israeli leadership, whoever they are, and on the basis that Palestinian leadership and people would accept. I wish I heard, I'm not going to discuss, Dahlan and how he comes. Whether it's Dahlan or other personalities or the leaders that you mentioned, are actually part of the Palestinian, political leadership, excluding Dahlan, who was actually dismissed officially. And now he works for the Emirati government as an employee. He's not a national figure of Palestinians anymore. And it's quite hard to actually, and trust me, I know that it's quite hard to move from being an employee to someone into a Palestinian leader. So that, I don't know how he negotiates. The $3 billion you mentioned in the Abraham Accords, my friend Ehud, I think the Manama conference offered even 10 times more than that. But the Palestinians are not going to trade off, living conditions for basic rights. I wish you had, more focus on how we could move the Palestinian-Israeli reality of today into a more promising future. Leaving aside radicalization and extremism, and get more into how we actually address all these issues and complexities that were created. I don't want to take more time, but Again, I assure you, I have not heard, and if there were people planning to storm Muqata'a, we would have heard here in Ramallah. Maybe there are Palestinian complaints about performance of leadership, but I assure you, one of the biggest things that this current Palestinian leadership with President Abbas on it pay for is pragmatism and moderation vis-a-vis Israel. And these are not popular activities. This is the president who actually indoctrinated security coordination, Ehud, from being, like a taboo in Palestinian society into being almost a consensus that everyone understands that nonviolence is the way and not attacks against Israelis. So, I would actually, be a bit fair and tell you that the line that the Palestinian leadership has taken is not as bad as it's described. It may be not perfect from an Israeli perspective, but we see it from this end as much more pragmatic, much more moderate, much more willing to accommodate and go back and learn from past mistakes. And one last point I would like to say is that none of the people that you have mentioned would actually be able to lead the Palestinians if they don't go through elections, which takes us to the question of elections between Hamas and Israel, between Hamas and Fatah. And once they agree, there is no way that anyone will rule the Palestinians if not elected by the people. This happened with Arafat, who was the iconic leader of the Palestinian people, happened with President Abbas, happened with Hamas winning the 2006 elections. No one was installed on the Palestinians as a leader. And eventually, with, I don't have to go into this much, but I want to tell you that, and you know this very well, that Palestinian internal affairs are not purely Palestinian internal affairs. There are regional challenges, international challenges, threats that are being made, actual imprisonment of people who actually work on reconciliation, like Hassan Yusuf of Hamas recently. So there are interferences and there are hardships. It's not an easy cake, but I want to tell you that there will be no political agreement between Hamas and Fatah if there is no political basis that would be sellable to the international community. I assure you of that. It's not going to be an alliance of PA moving towards, attacks against Israelis, so to speak. It's going to be on a refined political platform that would be acceptable by the Palestinian people and the international community at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Ehud, before you come on, since we have a limited amount of time, I'm trying to combine a lot of things. I have another question relating to all this from Tagri Al-Qadari from Palestine, and it's to you. So you have the floor to deal with response and this. The PA stopped receiving, this is her question, the PA stopped receiving the tax revenues this time because it demanded before the decision a review of the Paris protocols, but Israel refused. Also, yes, Dahlan is NBC's man via Gaza, but how will UAE deal with Hamas? And as you're reacting to that, I just a message for Niranjan Sahu from India. I think we've answered your question, and we're going to have to move on away from the United States policy. Okay, Ehud, your chance to get involved here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I think I have to say that in my opinion, my humble opinion, I may be wrong. I've been wrong in the past. I think that the degree of disgust and distrust of the Palestinian public in the West Bank towards the Palestinian Authority is at its height. And I think they know it. I know it, that they know it very well, and they are very worried about it, and rightly so. And when I said what I said about what happens if people decide to go for the Muqatta'a, the headquarters, I was not daydreaming. It's not my habit. Now, the Palestinians receiving the funds. The funds are available. The taxes are collected by Israel and should be transferred to the Palestinians. I'm dealing with it a lot in my private capacity, trying to get the money to go to the Palestinian Authority. And I said before, it's 3 billion shekels. Big money in terms of the West Bank economy. You cannot get the Palestinian Authority to accept the money. They came with stupid ideas, like we transfer, Ibrahim, correct me if I'm wrong, we transfer the money to Switzerland and Switzerland sends it back. This is not what the Oslo and Paris Accords were about, etc. You want the money of your customs transferred to you, come to us, we will give it to you. They don't want to come. So we have a situation now. Steve, I want you to listen to me. We have a situation now in which the Palestinian Authority is punishing its own citizens. So we have somebody that I personally like and appreciate, Mr. Saib Arikat, hospitalized in Jerusalem, Israeli Jerusalem, Hadassah Hospital, in a very bad condition of COVID-19. You can't imagine how many serious, middle of the road Israelis are saying this is not right. This guy has been saying that our soldiers are spitting in villages in the West Bank in order to spread the COVID-19. He did. So why do we treat him? I mean, the Palestinians have to, this Palestinian Authority have to come to grips with reality. And when they come to grip with reality, they will have a majority of Israelis willing to go for a generous two-state solution. Now, the second question was about UAE and Hamas. The UAE is dead set against the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is Muslim Brotherhood. But I think there is a chance that MBZ, and he's the guy who counts, will be willing to play a role with those assets he has, and he has them, in order to improve the situation in the Palestinian arena, mainly upgrading and restructuring the economy. And I think before I've always believed that before we talk about a political solution, which is elusive, it's difficult because the Palestinians don't want to give up the right of return and recognize Jewish rights or history in the land. What we need to do is to make the West Bank an economic success. Is it doable? I think it is. Can the UAE help? I'm sure it can. Let's go there.
Okay, this is for Ibrahim, although there's some for Ehud as well, if he wants to get in. It's from Firmas Rahim from Iraq. How do the recent agreements or normalization between Israel and some Arabian countries affect the Israel-Palestine relationship? Of course, we've been discussing it. Does it make the dialogues between the two more complex? Also, how do the recent agreements or normalization between Israel and some Arabian countries affect the Israeli-Palestinian relationship? Does it make the dialogues between the two more complex? Since we've been discussing this a little bit, let's be as quickly as possible. Ibrahim, you're on.
Thank you, Steve. I just want to say, yes, we discussed this, and I basically said that earlier that the approach that the Palestinian leadership is taking with those Arab countries who signed those normalization deals is basically to get to a point of understanding on how this would reflect positively on removing and resuming the peace talks on basis of that would actually ultimately create the Palestinian state on the terms that were laid out and signed in past signed agreements and international law. And I think in the past few days, in fact, even yesterday, the foreign minister of the Emirates was actually saying that he views that Emirates still view the end of Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of two-state solution. And the Saudi foreign minister has actually articulated more than once that they will not that the solution is the two-state solution. Does it make Palestinian-Israeli relations more complex? I think so, yes, because it again gives the Israeli right-wing government if you like, the gain that they want from Palestinian peace negotiations, because they look at the Palestinian conflict as a minor issue, and they look at the regional alliances that they're building, whether it's against Iran or other interests that they have with the Arab countries, as the strategic interest. And here I would have to say two things. One is that we learn from history of this conflict, and unfortunately it has been a long conflict, that at the end of the day, a superpower, regional superpower Israel is, and maybe world superpower Israel is, at the end of the day, without peace with the Palestinians, even individual security is not maintained in the streets of Israel. And this is not a call for violence. This is basically a reminder that the past 15 years, where Israeli security establishment has actually, I'm not going to say praised, but basically appreciated the Palestinian security efforts in preventing that reality, has been misused by the political leadership in Israel. Instead of being an opportunity to move forward, it has been an opportunity to break the Palestinian will. And again, starting negotiations on terms of reference does not necessarily mean it will be the end of it. The Palestinians have introduced, and Israelis have agreed to introduce, and US administrations agreed to use land swaps. They were even checking the possibilities of trying to get into transitional phases that would gradually take us, into a different situation. But thinking that, it's only about economy and, giving Palestinians more money would make them change their political stand on these issues is a mistake. There are two things that I would like to say. One, let me correct you. I don't think Dr. Erekat, and hopefully that he will recover, was the one who actually said that Israeli soldiers come and spread the coronavirus in Palestinian streets. It was another one. I'm not going to say who he is, but it was another one. And I want to tell you, even if it was, I haven't heard that statement, although I follow his statements closely. But even it was him. What I want to remind you of is that the fact that the Palestinian security coordination with Israel has been improved significantly, with almost in years passing with zero attacks, and Palestinians only trying to get IDF to stop incursions into Palestinian towns was failed by the Israeli right-wing government. That itself created this self-defense mechanism of hating to see Israeli soldiers inside Palestinian towns. And whether it reflects itself in angry, emotional, statements here and there, don't judge the Palestinian, official position on angry statements here and there. I know how effective this is. This flies in Israel, and mainly, through the right wing. But, there are professionals in Israel, including the security establishment, who know that this is not the Palestinian position, who know that these are like expression frustrations. There was nothing, that was done in order to actually compensate, the Palestinians, whether economically or otherwise, for security or in terms of restoring PA control over Area A, since it was eroded back in 2002. The other last point I want to tell you on and this is a big topic, the tax revenues topic. When you talk to Palestinian financial experts and you talk to Palestinian finance, Ministry of Finance officials, they have grave concerns about the way that Israel deducts and the way that they collect fees and make deductions. I'm not going to mention the prisoners' payments or anything else, but I just want to tell you that there were calls by the Palestinians to open the Paris Protocol and efforts, including by French, to open the Paris Protocol so that you have a clear line of how to resume the transfer of funds. It's not a condition, but it's something that needs to happen. And I'm not saying that this is going to, be implemented immediately, but I'm just throwing out there some of the needs that need to be addressed in order to get the Palestinian-Israeli relations on the right track and leaving behind, the Trump peace deal, because it won't work. To resolve or to bridge gaps between the Israelis and Palestinians on that term. And sadly, we will continue to be in conflict circles if we do not pick up the opportunity to actually address each other's concerns on a more balanced view, not by breaking the will of one side to the other because of the wealth and might of the US as a superpower. One last sentence. Dr. Nasser al-Qudwa was a good friend of everybody, is not newly married to a French woman. He's been married to that woman for 30 years. And I know from a personal experience that she has been suffering from being married to a Palestinian official. Maybe she had thought or otherwise when she got married, but basically I just wanted to point out that he's not newly married.
All right, we'll leave the marriage debates aside. This is for Ehud. I'm adding a question. Ibrahim may want to get in, but we're going to go a little over, but we don't have that much time. How much influence is Turkey likely to wield over the upcoming Hamas leadership elections, if any? Is Khalid Mashal Turkey's candidate? And that was from Alan Makovsky from Washington, D.C. in the United States.
Yeah, hi, Alan. Now, first I have to say to my friend Ibrahim, yes, I know she's not a new wife. She's new after the last one. But the point I was trying to make that Nasser al-Qudwa chooses to stay in Nice, France, and the Riviera, and not in the West Bank. That's the point. And the point is there. The second thing I want to say about Saib Arikat. When Saib was admitted to the Israeli hospital Hadassah, I happened to be friends with the director of the hospital, a famous Israeli professor, and I said to him one thing: make sure there are Arab doctors, lots of them in Hadassah, Arab nurses, lots of them in Hadassah, and the team treating him. Because if, God forbid, Said doesn't make it, and he had the lungs transplant and the etc., then I know what would be the reaction. And Ibrahim, that was the right advice I gave. Now, the last question, Steve, was?
The last question was about Turkey and
Ah.
Hamas and who Turkey favors.
Yeah, okay. Turkey would like to have to sponsor Hamas Fatah reconciliation, which allows Hamas best into the back into the West Bank, at least with political activity. But Turkey, President Erdogan, also allows terrorist operations to be directed and operated out of Istanbul. That's no news. I think the Turks would like the Qataris, would like Khaled Mashal to win. As I said before, this would not be my expectation. I don't think they are going to win it.
Okay, I'm going to have a question here, and this is going to again go for Ehud. I think it's more for him. Hamid Ahmani from Iran. Many analysts argue that the Israeli-Bahrain UAE agreements have a basic goal to contain Iran. Do you think that Israel hopes to get some concession from two Arab states regarding their views on the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
No, of course, Iran is in the background. We have a problem, we Israel have a problem with Iran in Lebanon, Syria, etc. And the UAE and Bahrain have problems with Iran in the Gulf. But one should not view this in the context of an anti-Iranian alliance. In fact, I was trying to describe before that it's more on the western side of the Middle East, more on the East Med and Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, etc. I don't think that the Iranians or anybody else expect Israel to use UAE, to be allowed to use UAE bases to attack Iran in case somebody decides it's time to do it. It reminds me of those stories in the American media. Lots of stuff. People write whatever they like. So there was this guy, Perry, who wrote about the Israelis acquiring air bases in Azerbaijan in order to be in close proximity of the Iranian nuclear site. And I remember at the time I was so upset about this stupidity that I wrote a response article under the title Fairy Tales. Mr. Perry says so-and-so fairy tales. No, Israel UAE is not that much about Iran. It's much more about the Arab region, the Red Sea, the East Med, the Arab Peninsula, and the Palestinians. That's where it is. It's not a combination to confront Iran.
All right, being bombarded, there's even now debate as to which questions I should ask. So let me ask both of you one that involves several of you. And so I apologize for not asking your question specifically, and that is Jordan. What role does Jordan play in all this? Either one of you want to take this? Ibrahim, Ehud? Ibrahim.
Yes. I think one of the closest partners, if you will, to the Palestinian leadership has been the Jordanian government. And I think, just from a quick look on the official public positions that the Jordanian government had on everything that has happened in the past 4 years, including normalization agreements, would tell you that Jordan is standing, facing the same threats and challenges and the same interests as the Palestinians. They are interested in the creation of a Palestinian state. They are interested in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on fair and just political terms. And they are not standing against Emiratis or Saudis in the sense that, this would create enmity between the Arab countries. And as I said, I think that there is a big influence and coordination between the Jordanians and the Palestinians to get out of the negative impact of the Trump peace plan, which actually put the whole situation in this impasse. Despite the gains that my friend Ehud was talking about, I don't think that this would reflect positively if these remain as Israel's only choice in terms of preferring regional contact with and normalization with Arab countries over resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There are two things that, and I think we went over time, but I would like actually to mention, without going into private things, but my advice to Ehud and even to other Israeli observers, not to over personalize. Yes, we are an individual-based political system, but not to over generalize it, because those are people at the end of the day. Dr. Nasser went to France after spending a year being locked out, here away from his family. And there are other private reasons that I know of, but I can't speak of. So at the end of the day, this does not constitute, I think, a political maneuvering the way that it's, presented. With regards to Dr. Riqat, we all wish him, of course, recovery. Medicine, Ehud, is one of the greatest ethical sciences and services, and I don't really think we need to over politicize it. There were critical voices across the Palestinian, in the Palestinian community, but everyone, I think, all wise people have came out against it, because at the end of the day, you need medical service in order to serve humanity more, and this is above and beyond politics. And if there is any criticism to the PA, it's actually that they even reduced the number of referrals to Israeli hospitals at the time that we don't have equal services. And I admit this, to you and to all the audience, that we do want to get the best of medical services, which are available to Israel, are not available to us yet. We hope to actually follow the term, and in 20, 30 years, if we get to a solution to the conflict or not, to have, equal services. And that's purely a humanitarian matter, and it needs to be depoliticized as much as possible. And one last thing that I would like to actually mention, Steve, and of course to Ehud and all the audience, is that against all odds, what we need to remember is that if we fail at this stage or even in the short and medium term, to get beyond, all those, petty political complications serving, certain political groups, whether in Israel or on the Palestinian side, we will, we may not live enough to actually see, but new generations like us will live the consequences of what happened in the 40s and 50s. We have the choice today to actually, try to shift. If we give, you mentioned a generous two-state solution, Ehud. There are paradigms, there are ways to actually go around this and try to get, on the right track. There is an opportunity, in my opinion, and I hope that this would not actually fade away and go away. And I call you to even, think together on those terms and present to the leaderships on both sides some creative ideas on how to bypass, obstacles, rather than dig in and keep the conflict going and basically lose another opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I have, we're coming to our close. I have 3 questions, one from Israel, 2 from Palestine, which are related to each other. You have no idea how many questions we've received, and we can't possibly get to everybody, but I'm going to read these 3, and then you can pick and choose what you want to deal with, both of you. And I don't think either one of you is going to be very happy with these questions. First, Gershon Baskin in Israel. When do you think we should be more honest with the Palestinians, the Israelis, and with the US, and declare that there is no viable 2-state solution anymore and it's time to come up with something else? From Dr. Mekaimar Abu Saida from Palestine, Palestinian reconciliation is doomed to fail, but what are the Israeli and American incentives to the Palestinian leadership to come back to the negotiations table? And finally, from Ahmed Muharrab from Palestine, I did not hear anything about the challenges that face Israel from Ehud. Does that mean Israel is not expected to face any challenges? And actually, as long as I'm doing this, there's another one that's very close I see in all my pile. Mohammed Shmeisani from Jordan, it looks like we will not see present Israeli and Palestinian leaders who are able to progress for peace. Okay, fellas, you can pick and choose. Those are the 4 questions. I think it's Ehud's turn.
My pleasure. First, on Jordan, I think that,
Ehud, can I ask you to speak up, please?
yes, you can.
Thank
Can
you.
you hear me now?
That was Manny Jad.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think Jordan is upset and disgusted with both the Israeli and the Palestinian leadership. And I stand to be corrected. I don't think anybody wants to correct me on that. The other thing, the point with Saeb Erekat, that I hope his recovery is the fact that the Palestinian Authority does not allow the regular Palestinian West Bank citizen to get medical treatment in Israeli hospitals. They are prohibiting this, but they have allowed one of their own to get it. And people in the West Bank, not me, not my wife, not my daughter, are very upset about it. That's not something that's easily overturned. If I am a Palestinian in Nablus who requires some, I don't know, cancer treatment in a good Israeli hospital, I cannot get the PA to allow me to go. But if I'm Saeb Erekat and I understand his condition and I feel for him and I've known him for 40 years and like him, then he can go. People react to this in the West Bank. About Nasser Kidwa, doesn't matter. No, not, Ibrahim, you know Nasser is.
No, it's like private. It's not,
No,
I mean.
it's not private. Nothing is private.
Okay.
Nasser, it doesn't matter how many years he's married to his wife. What matters is that he chooses to be in Nice, France. Just like Salam Fayyad, another contender, chooses to stay in the US. Or if you want, Dakhlan chooses to be between Serbia and UAE. That's what is important, that the contenders are not on the ground, those of them who can afford it. Now, Muhammad's, my friend, question.
Which question was this?
Muhammad Abu Saada.
I have to find it, and I've got a big list, but let me do so as quickly as I can. Manny, do you have it?
Yes, I have it. From Muhammad, he said Palestinian reconciliation is doomed to fail. But when are the Israelis and American incentives to the Palestinian leadership to come back to the negotiation table?
Okay. I think I'm saying it bluntly, and I do not represent anybody. It's not in the interest of Israel now to have a Hamas-Fatah reconciliation. Let's not beat around the bush. And the second is because we are unable to reach that two-state deal, end of conflict, end of claims with the Palestinians, what we have to do for the time being is try to upgrade the West Bank, build an economy. They have been wasting, forgive me, Ibrahim, for ever since Oslo, 93, 27 years, the Palestinians have wasted billions and billions of dollars of aid without building an economy, just paying and subsidizing an ever-expanding public sector and a patronage system. Enough. Let's do it differently. And I think that if you ask the Arabs, including King Abdullah of Jordan, they will agree with me. It's time to start doing something. It's time to start building the foundations, as Salam Fayyad said, the foundations of a state. Instead of this ever-expanding patronage system and paying for Tazim groups everywhere. It's about time, because it's not going to continue. Sorry for being blunt.
Okay, so do you have comments? I'm sure you do, Ibrahim.
Yes, I actually do. And I want to, first of all, thank Ehud for his, precious advices. Again, I won't divulge any private reasons why Dr. Nasser Al-Qudwi is there, in Nice. He has the full right to be with his family during certain times after, everybody suffered from the lockup of coronavirus for almost a year, and he's one of them, but he has also other reasons to be there. And I don't want to focus the discussion on individuals, but basically, I think it's important to, I'm going to say something, Ehud, and please check with all your friends, and I know you have many of the former US officials. This program of, reducing Palestinian transfer of health cases to Israel is something that started in 2012. And you know how it started? I was actually part of, communications, and I, presented my objection to it. It started as a US-Israeli-Palestinian plan to reduce transfers to Israeli hospitals, and to promote, with good intention, to promote health services in the West Bank, to what was called to basically provide the services in the homeland. And that failed miserably, in my opinion. And I told the once, a US official who was involved in this, that if I get sick or any of my sons or daughters get sick, I'll take him to an Israeli hospital. It's not because I like Israel or I'm a Zionist. It's basically because the best medical services is something that everybody is looking for. And yes, the PA failed in that particular aspect. But saying that only officials get transferred to Israeli hospitals is not accurate. And you can ask Ms. Dalia Al-Bassa, who's the health coordinator. There are average Palestinian people who actually get transferred, but it has been on a very limited scale, in my opinion, because of a stupid plan introduced back then by the US, Israel, and the PA. And I'm not going to say more on this. But please, Anna, I want to, basically finish my remarks and say, I saw someone on two remarks. One, people casting doubt on the Hamas Fatah reconciliation. And of course, they have the full right to after 13 years of division. But you know what? I think, if we look at other people's experiences, including that of the US and including, European countries and including Israel, going into civil wars and confrontations and differences on a national scale is something to be expected when you have a path towards independence. That is not something unique to Palestinians. Our reality is much more complex than that of the United States and Israel, which is like in ancient past. But, I don't think that determination will go away. Maybe this round will fail and another round will fail. But eventually, Hamas and Fatah are basically the same people. You know that you mentioned Jibril Rujub, right? Jibril Rujub and his brother is one Hamas leader and one Fatah leader. At the end of the day, this, against all the odds and regional interferences that you refer to, whether it's Iranians or Turks or others, or Israelis for that matter, complicate the Palestinian reconciliation. It's not only because of internal Palestinian, factors. And my hope is that this will not be the impediment to independence. Eventually, it will have to be overcome. And it doesn't matter whether it's overcome this week or this month or this round or a year later, because you and I know that there will be no viable two-state solution without Palestinian unity. It can't be. It can't be three states. It can't be Gaza state, West Bank state, mini West Bank state. It doesn't work. So that is one of the imperatives that we'll have to overcome against the odds. And it's no secret to tell you, I mean, you know this. that as the Hamas and Fatah basically started the dialogues, there were so many interferences. I'm talking about the recent one, that from the outlook of it, it's because Hamas and Fatah yet failed again. But the reality is much harsher than that. There are interferences that come from very powerful forces in the region. And I'm not going to name countries and names here or blame them, but I'm just saying it's complex and it's not as easy as it should be. One of the participants, Steve, had a question saying, do you really think that peace is ever possible? And I would like to respond to that and actually say, yes, it might not be in my lifetime. I'm getting too old, but I think eventually it must be. It has to be. This conflict cannot, remain an external and perpetual conflict forever. And there has to be, at one point, a wake-up call for Israelis and for Palestinians that this conflict needs to come to terms. We share the same land, the same homeland, the same space, the same air, the same water, the same resources, but we're fighting over it. We can look at a different perspective and basically, and I'm not, a daydreamer here. I'm just saying that, comparing the Palestinian-Israeli reality in the 90s to the Palestinian-Israeli reality today against all the difficulties, we moved from denying Israel's right to existence into accepting it. The Israelis, they were calling us when I was a kid, residents of the territories. They would never even call us Palestinians. Today, they admit that there is a Palestinian and a Palestinian problem, but we disagree on the details. In 20 years, I hope, I again might not survive it, but my hopes is that my children and my grandchildren are not going to have the same fights and struggles that we have. And with that, I end, and I hope that this would also, and I'm sure that Ehud has the same dream, and I hope. So I thank you for that, and I think we have really over. When I'm glad. I'm not complaining, but I'm just saying we went over time. So, and I leave you managed, Steve. I'm not complaining.
Pardon, I'm just going to give you guys one more question, 2 more minutes, and we are completed. And that's from our own Manny Jad, who you just heard from, our deputy director from the United States. And the question is, and it's exactly related to what Ibrahim was just saying, what has been the Palestinian-Israeli reaction to Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia's interview in Al Arabiya a few weeks ago, in which he advocated the kind of moves that have led to the UAE, Israeli, now Bahrain, and who knows, as I've said before, who else in all these deals. He was quite direct, I thought. Any quick comments from either one of you?
You mean Palestinian reaction to Prince Bandar?
Yes.
I think the Palestinian leadership did not respond or did not react to his statements. He is like a former official. He's not a currently, sort of like serving official. Ehud is not. He is a former, he is a distinguished, high-profile character, prince, all of that. But he's not an official member of the Saudi government. For the Palestinian government or leadership to respond to his statements, that's how I understood it, and that's how I saw it. But more importantly, I would like to actually mention that, he had so many frustrations. That's my personal opinion over the Palestinians, going back to Hajj Amin al-Husseini in the 40s and his mistakes with, allying with Hitler against the British, who were basically fighting and killing Palestinians at that time. It's not that he actually went to Germany because he's a Nazi. He went to Germany because that was the only force that was fighting the British. And I'm not going to go into history, there. But regardless of what he did back then, I think, the outburst of Prince Bandar and his frustration over the performance of the Palestinian political leaderships over ages is not, in my opinion, an objective reading of the current reality. And the current reality is that Palestinians are not rejectionists of everything, and they are working according and in harmony with, again, the Arab Peace Initiative is a Saudi initiative that the Palestinians accepted. They even marketed it. I remember in 2012 that the Palestinian leadership spent, I don't know if you remember this, Ehud, but they spent something like $6 million, if I'm not mistaken, trying to promote publications and other promotion materials in Israel and elsewhere in the region on the Arab Peace Initiative. So it's not that the Palestinian leadership has always been rejectionist the way that it was described, although there were tactical mistakes throughout, the history. But again, if we continue looking at the past and blaming, and extending blame to each other, and especially I'm talking here about the Israelis and Palestinians who know each other much better than others, looking at the situation from outside in, what we need to do is basically move forward and try to learn from the past mistakes. So if, I assure you, Ehud, if, Nazi country would actually emerge, Palestinian leadership would not go to ally with it. It's just not what the Palestinian people are looking for. They're looking for, peace and, prosperity the same way that you guys in Israel and you guys in the US are looking for. The question is in what terms and how we actually get there. And, I wanted to also mention.
Yes, we've got to end.
We got to end? Okay.
Well, no, just finish your sentence.
Yeah. One last point is, again, the differences of the past should not continue to govern and blaming and extending blames to each other. And that includes Palestinian and Arab relations. And again, as I said, I'm confident that there are contacts to resolve those differences that emerged after the normalization deals. That doesn't mean Palestinians will approve those, but will actually look for a way to use that specifically to promote Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations.
Ehud, that's a nice last comment.
Yes.
You've got a couple of sentences to conclude.
I have to, and it's not that simple. What Prince Bandar was saying in 3 hours, 3-part interview to Al Arabiya, which is in English, available to everybody, people should read. The Mufti, for example, Haj Amin al-Husseini, a relative of Yasser Arafat, Ibrahim, remember? He supported the Nazi effort to exterminate the Jews of Europe. He did every way he could. There is no way to deny it. There are many books about it. And this is what Prince Bandar was referring to as one of many, many examples of Palestinian leadership's mistakes all over the way for along 1 century. The other thing, finally, I want to say is, yes, we will have a deal with the Palestinians, because I don't think the Palestinians want to become citizens of Israel, equal rights, doesn't matter. And I don't think Israelis want to become a binational state. So it will come. The question is how much pain, how long it's going to take. But in the meantime, I'm telling you as an Israeli, we are going to manage the conflict. We are not going to let the Palestinians collapse into our unwilling arms. Not in Gaza, not in the West Bank. They will stand on their feet, even if we have to support them. But we are not going into a one-state situation. This should be imprinted on the mind of every Palestinian. Thank you.
Thank you both for this phenomenal discussion. We only continued as long as we did because we had so many people that had, so many of you participants who had remained here with us. And I think that's a great testimony to the effectiveness of both of our speakers. In conclusion, CMAN has several upcoming programs for the fall quarter. Our office will be in touch with you as they emerge. We'd like to thank the Lesson School of Public Affairs, the Berkel Center for International Relations at UCLA, and the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, whose director, Dov Waxman, has a piece in today's Times of Israel asking Israelis whether Trump has been good for them. It's quite an interesting article. I want to recommend it and recognize it. And in conclusion, we want to thank so much our staff, Salameh Mahajer, who was in charge of all of this and did all this incredible work and never ceases to work. Manny Jad, who you've met several times in this session, our deputy director, who we all depend on. Emily Pistoli, a new member of our group. Summer Smesme, who is so important to our activities. And Ryan Ang, who helped us so much. So until our next session, let me say our very best and hope to everyone. And we hope that everyone